material here to cover, as Ilham suggested. We had a three-day workshop into which all of this was elaborated in much greater detail in Fiji last year. So I've done my best in trying to restructure this to bring out some of the most relevant aspects, focusing really on the policy, regulatory, and ultimately the PPA design questions. So I've really tried to put a focus on those aspects, though there were a lot of other dimensions that unfortunately weren't able to make it into this slide. So I encourage you, if you are interested for sort of more detailed, more in-depth coverage of some of these issues, to keep an eye on the IRENA website for the more detailed text that Ilham mentioned. So given that our time is fairly constrained, I'm going to dive in and we can get started. So the quick overview of the presentation. So we're going to start with the role of renewable energy targets in island regions in particular. We're going to look at net metering, at feed-in tariffs, at utility-led approaches to renewable energy development. We realized in looking around the world that many islands, many utilities in particular, were actually becoming active participants in developing their own renewable energy projects. And that doesn't really fall neatly under either feed-in tariffs or net metering or even auctions in some cases. So utilities are developing their own approaches, and we thought it was worth highlighting that as an alternative deployment pathway for renewable energy in island regions. And then the final section looks more closely at the issues of designing bankable PPAs. In that section, obviously, there's a lot of issues that are unique to islands that are very technical and site-specific. So if there are follow-up questions on that after the webinar, I'd be glad to discuss further and answer any additional questions on that. So first, targets. Looking around the world, there are currently 146 different countries that have targets as of early 2015. And targets have really become a defining feature of the global renewable energy sector, and one could argue of the global energy sector, as governments start to prioritize the transition and the diversification of the energy mix towards renewable energy sources. Targets play a very important role in signaling to investors and in mobilizing some of the key stakeholders that you need in order to achieve the target. While governments are often the ones that establish the target, actually achieving it relies on hundreds, if not thousands, of different actors and stakeholders in the market. That could be citizens, small businesses, suppliers, developers, utilities, et cetera, in the environment. So it's really important in the design of targets to have thorough engagement with stakeholders so that you can mobilize them to help achieve the target. Because ultimately the target won't be reached without some degree of mobilization from the key actors. It's important to highlight quickly that we're working on finalizing a report with IRENA specifically on this question of renewable energy targets. So keep your eyes out for that in the months ahead. Some of the rationale. So why do governments set targets? I've referred to these a few times, or just briefly in a few of my comments a moment ago. Obviously, there's an energy security imperative. Many countries are highly import dependent, in particular in island regions. So this is a common thread almost, I would venture, across all islands. Reducing fossil fuel consumption, improving access is often a related objective. In some cases, it's a strong driver of climate change or reducing environmental risks. And obviously, there are macroeconomic benefits, job creation, economic diversification, and rectifying some of the trade imbalance, so import imbalance issues in the economy. So renewable energy can play a very powerful role in addressing and mitigating some of those issues. And finally, renewable energy targets can play a powerful role in increasing private sector investments in the electricity sector in particular. So some of the main drivers. Taking a look around the world, what's really encouraging at least from my standpoint, as I researched this over the years, is that we're seeing more and more islands, more and more regions of the world get increasingly ambitious. We're not talking about 10% or 20% targets anymore, as is common in many renewable portfolio standards, for example, in countries like the United States or the UK. We're really talking about much more ambitious strategies, much more ambitious targets. So just recently, Tokelau has become, I think, the first island to be 100% powered by solar in its electricity sector. And many other islands around the world are in the process of following suit. Not only in the electricity sector, some islands like Samso, for example, are also focusing on the heating and cooling sector and gradually on the transport sector. So we're starting to see the emergence of more holistic energy transition strategies driven by these more ambitious renewable energy targets. And I think that's a really, in many ways, a very encouraging sign. But fundamentally, as I pointed out briefly, in order to achieve those targets, it's necessary to have clear policies and a clear strategy. And that's going to really be the focus and the core of the presentation today. So we'll look at three different approaches: net metering, or what is sometimes also called net billing, feed-in tariffs, as well as the utility-led approaches that I mentioned. Now, the utility-led approaches take a number of different forms. We'll try to elaborate a little bit what those look like, but it does present an alternative pathway in certain island regions. So let's start with net metering. So first, what is net metering? At its most basic, in its most basic design, it allows customer-sited renewables to produce electricity, inject it into the grid in order to offset their on-site consumption. So in other words, the meter runs backwards. During the sunny moments of the day, if you have a PV net metered system, the meter will roll forward. And if you're in the evening importing power from the grid, it rolls backwards. And at the end of every month, you do a netting of that amount. And you'll either be in surplus or in deficit. And normally you can carry that, you get a credit if you've produced more electricity than you've consumed, and that credit can be carried over, usually up to about 12 months. And in most net metering policies, after 12 months, the rollover gets canceled, and then you start the new year. So that's classic net metering. Here's a visual that helps capture it. So you can see it's a useful and simple summary of the way that it works. The inverter, the energy can be used either in a home, school, or business. This can also apply to non-PV technologies. There are net metering policies that allow biogas, landfill gas-based systems that allow wind, even in some cases, or other technologies to net meter with the grid. So one question that comes up, and there's a lot of confusion in this debate. I'm going to try to shed a little bit of light and try to really clarify this as well as I can between net metering and net billing. So classic net metering, as I described, normally just credits the customer at the same rate as the electricity is purchased. So if you pay 30 cents per kilowatt hour for your electricity in an island in the Pacific, you can export power to the grid and be credited at that same rate effectively. And it normally uses one bidirectional meter. So it's one meter that can flow both ways. Net billing, by contrast, at least in its classic form, the rate that customers are credited at is different from the rate that they pay. And that's why the word billing is used, because it's more of an accounting convention. It's used to credit the rate that you export power at a different price than the one you pay. Normally, that's in order to recognize that the utility has costs that they need to factor in. So administration costs, metering, often the utility will pay for the meter, so they give you a little bit less than the retail price. And that would be similar, that would be a classic net billing. The problem with this linguistic issue is that the terms are not used consistently. If you look at islands around the world, the terms are used in some places in a very different way than they are used in other islands. And this has created a lot of confusion. I encourage people to focus rather on the design of the policy and not so much on the label, because in many cases the label is not reflective of what the policy actually does. And that's generated a lot of confusion that, and I'm sure a lot of work for people around the world trying to tease out these different aspects of the policy. So again, the key is to focus on the actual design. What does the policy actually do? So how can you determine the appropriate rate to credit net excess generation under a net metering policy? Now, net metering is really important in island regions and is increasingly popular in island regions because it allows a lot of customers pay very high tariffs, and as a result, they have an interest in developing on-site generation. This can be seen in islands around the world, whether in Hawaii, the Cook Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, throughout the Caribbean. There's a host of different jurisdictions that are actively implementing net metering policies driven by customer demand, driven by ratepayers who want to offset a portion of their bills. But now the question for utility becomes, well, how do we design this? Or for the government, how do we design this policy? So there are three different basic options. On the one hand, you can compensate customers at a rate that is below the retail rate. The example that I've cited here is Palau, where they essentially provide a credit at 50% of the avoided cost for the utility. So a significant discount to avoided costs. And that's largely because avoided costs are so high. There's a concern that if the full avoided costs were paid, or even close to the full avoided costs, that it would overcompensate customers. The second option is classic net metering, essentially let the meter roll back at the retail rate. This is quite common in the U.S. and in other jurisdictions. And the third option is to compensate at a rate that is even above the retail rate. This remains rather rare, but there are a couple of examples of it. At least there were until PV prices crashed in recent years. The most common are either number one or number two. So, as I mentioned, the cost of PV technology has dipped below retail rates, and often in many island regions below the utilities avoided costs of generation. So in an unregulated environment, there would be, in theory, substantial customer-sited generation development in order to undercut the cost that the utility is paying, because a hotel, for example, could develop its own or contract its own solar power in order to provide cheaper power than is available from the grid. In island regions, those tensions are very real, and we're seeing significant changes, even in some cases quite disruptive changes to the utility business model in certain island regions because of that fundamental economic reality of the high cost of generation. Many utilities and regulatory agencies are increasingly concerned that if you give a full credit under sort of classic net metering, if you just let the meter roll back, that'll actually lead to overcompensation. In other words, that customers will be getting too good of a deal. And that then leads to a second related issue, which is cost shifting between customers. So specifically between the customers that have solar PV systems or on-site generation and those who do not. And that can generate a host of issues for the utility as well as for the government. So there's been a pressure to try to design net metering that does not fall into that trap, while still allowing the opportunity for customer-sited generation to be cost-effective and contribute to electricity supply on the network. So why would island utilities encourage customer-owned and sited generation? On the surface, a utility is in the business of supplying electricity. Why would they want customers to start gradually taking over that business? There's a host of reasons behind this, a host of rationales and drivers. One, as I mentioned briefly, is that is increasing customer demand. Customers want to participate by developing their own on-site supply. Another major driver is that often utilities are quite capital constrained, and they don't have enough current cash flow or even capacity to borrow in order to invest in new generation assets, or they're often constrained in doing so. So using customers or encouraging customers to participate, so to speak, in the generation business can help alleviate some of the capital constraints that utilities are facing. So that's another important driver. There's also a strong rationale that if, as these 2 points underscore, if the customer-sided generation is cheaper than what the utility's generation cost is. So for example, if a utility has a cost of generation of 40 cents per kilowatt hour, and they can encourage customers to produce power at somewhere around 15 or 20 cents, then that represents a significant bargain, because the utility could effectively buy or credit customer-sided generation at a rate that's lower than their own cost, and then wheel that power to their neighbors. So if you had, for example, a household or a hotel or a business that was exporting extra power, the utility could buy or credit that at, say, 20 cents or 15 cents per kilowatt hour, and then sell it on to the neighbor for 30 or 40 cents per kilowatt hour, and effectively earn a profit or markup on that transaction. So if customer-sided generation is cheaper than utility-avoided costs, there's a very compelling rationale to get customers in the business of supplying power, contributing to power supply in island regions. And there's nowhere in the world where that's clearer than in island regions. The second situation that's important to distinguish is if the electricity tariffs that the utility charges are below cost recovery. In other words, if the tariffs are set by the government and the utility is actually losing money on kilowatt hour sales, then it may make also sense to encourage customer-sided generation, because you're effectively losing money on every kilowatt hour sold. So if you're selling fewer kilowatt hours, you're losing less money, all else being equal. So in certain environments like that, there can actually be quite a compelling pure financial or purely economic reason to encourage that customer-sided generation to occur. And this is really where we are in this rapidly evolving space in island regions around the world. So the important take-home message here is that there is an opportunity to produce both net benefits and savings for society as well as for the utility. And I think that's what's, on the one hand, very encouraging and very exciting about what's happening in island regions around the world. One of the questions that's often raised in these discussions, and we had some of these debates in Fiji, and I routinely encounter this on islands around the world, is, well, if I design a net metering policy in my island and I have high retail rates, won't my customers just jump on the bandwagon and leave me, the utility, with less revenues to cover my fixed costs, and then may even threaten my solvency in the long run? Many utilities will express a sentiment similar to this in one form or another when faced with debating issues of supporting customer-sided generation. This is a very common, it must be said, a very real concern that utilities face. So how do you balance that? On the one hand, all net metering policies include various forms of caps. So it's not like a free-for-all. It's not the wild, wild west. There are restrictions. So there are restrictions on project size that limit how big individual projects can be. I've cited a couple of examples. There are caps on total program size, so how large the total amount of customer-sided generation can actually be. In some cases, it's based on peak demand or the number of megawatts. Interestingly, in Hawaii, as you see in point number 3, there's a development to implement caps on the total penetration on a per circuit basis. in the grid. And that's a very different kind of cap. Hawaii is the first, to my mind, at least that I've seen, that has done this. And they essentially imposed a 15% limit on a per circuit basis. Now that, again, is a debatable point. I think there's a lot of issues with this, both in implementation and in practice, and in principle, but it remains a further approach to cap the development. And the fourth one is a cap based on percentage of annual on-site load. So for example, you can restrict how much a household or business, how big their PV system can actually be based on how big the on-site load is. So that sort of provides a cap or a way to cap how much extra power any individual customer can export to the grid. And by doing that, you can help manage, in a way, the growth of customer-sided generation on the network. Now, often, many net metering policies include combinations of these. So these are not mutually exclusive. They often are combined together to provide an overall, a more restrictive, a more controlled approach to customer-sided generation, a more controlled environment. Now, again, there are some pros and cons of this. Some would argue that we should have much more creative destruction. We should have a lot more customer-sided generation because it's cheaper. And utilities in response will say, well, someone still needs to be responsible for reliability and maintaining fixed system costs and fixed operation costs, like maintaining substations and distribution lines. So there's a sweet spot, I think, or a balance somewhere in the middle there, and that's what jurisdictions ultimately have to strive to find. So a further point that's worth keeping in mind is that net metering is not just about the compensation rate, whether it's above or at retail or below retail rates, but there's a host of other design elements that go into a net metering policy. So the permitting procedure, for example, how detailed is the permits? You know, what do you need to show? How large can the site projects be? What about the customer sizes, customer classes? Is it only residential, or can commercial and industrial participate too? The rollover. How long can excess generation be rolled over on a month-to-month or year-to-year basis? As well as this issue of fixed charges. So many net metering policies include fixed charges, or many electricity rates include fixed charges that are different from the generation or consumption charges. So one of the questions, one of the design issues in the sort of mechanics of net metering is, can the credit offset the fixed charges as well, or do they only offset the consumption portion of the bill? And those sorts of issues may not seem very obvious at first, but they become really critical in the design stages of in the design aspects of feed-in tariff or of net metering policy. So this is really those aspects can be just as important as the actual compensation mechanism. There's a final related question of whether net metering or hybrids of net metering can provide actually a cash payment as well if there's persistent excess generation from the customer. And that opens up a whole other issue, which brings us somewhat closer to feed-in tariffs, where there's actually a per kilowatt hour payment for on-site generation. And that's what we're going to get to here in a moment. So net metering is ultimately a unique package. Every individual policy is a unique package of policy, regulatory, and administrative provisions, permitting, a host of other billing conventions and accounting provisions. So the key and the challenge for many island regions is to design net metering in a way that encourages customer-sided generation in a way that delivers savings, both ideally for society and for the utility. And I think looking at the experience so far around the world, there is a clear win-win-win to be had here. A win on one hand for the utilities that are facing high generation costs, a win for the customers because they can reduce their bills, and a win also for the environment and for energy security by improving the island's overall energy self-sufficiency. And I think a well-designed net metering policy can deliver this kind of win-win-win scenario. The challenge is ultimately designing it and implementing it carefully. Now, let's shift out of the world of net metering and into the world of feed-in tariffs. Now, feed-in tariffs are most common in mainland jurisdictions, at least historically, most famously in Germany, where I'm currently based, but you have feed-in tariffs in roughly 100 different jurisdictions, countries around the world that have some kind of feed-in tariff in place. So it's become a very, very widely used policy mechanism, and particularly to encourage generation. So 100% of exports go to the grid. And this is fundamentally different from traditional net metering, where people can offset their on-site consumption. So from a design perspective, that's really the most basic difference, is feed-in tariffs encourage effectively independent power producers to export power to the network, whereas net metering allows and encourages customer-sided generation that offsets on-site load, on-site consumption. So at the most basic level, that's the distinction. So there are obviously a host of others, which we'll get to. So feed-in tariffs include three key elements: a clear price, usually a fixed price for the electricity sold to the grid, a clear long-term contract for that supply, as well as guaranteed access to the grid. And traditionally, feed-in tariffs use two separate meters. So if you're a household who has a PV system on the roof, you have two meters, and you receive both a check and a bill at the end of the month. So you're still paying the utility for your power, and you're exporting it into the local distribution system. And the prices are locked in, irrespective of utility avoided costs. So a classic feed-in tariff is typically independent from avoided costs. There are exceptions to this, but in most cases, it's a fixed long-term contract, effectively like a PPA, for independent generation sold to the network. This, for the utility, can provide a hedge against volatility, which can be great. But for customers and for investors, this is particularly important because it helps improve bankability, and it allows broader participation from actors in the market. So this is the fact that you get a standard contract and a clear price and access to the grid is really important for encouraging participation in the generation business and increasing the overall sort of democratization of electricity supply. And feed-in tariffs have arguably been more successful than any other single policy at doing that. As I mentioned, they're used in approximately 100 jurisdictions, responsible for almost 50% of wind power investment, as well as roughly 75% of global solar PV investment. So it's been a very, very widespread. Now the question is, can this work? Can this policy be applied and adopted in island regions? And there are clear examples where it has been, like Hawaii, for example, but the question remains for many small island developing states whether feed-in tariffs are a viable policy option or a desirable policy option. We'll get into that in a moment. So why have FITs worked? I've tried to hint at some of this, but on the one hand, they provide attractive policy and regulatory conditions, so long-term contract, which is key often to get a loan and in order to invest and encourage investment in renewable energy projects. They provide a clear cost-based price for the electricity over a long-term contract, so there's some degree of overall certainty and stability built into the policy, and often differentiated pricing by technology, so and by project size. So if you have a slightly different generation cost from wind to solar, for example, you would have a different feed-in tariff to reflect that. And similarly for project size. So some smaller project sizes may be a little bit more expensive than larger projects. Roof-mounted may, in some cases, though not always, be more expensive than ground-mounted systems, and different tariffs can be offered for that based on the overall cost of supply, the cost of generation. Now, a similar question emerges as we saw with the net metering. A lot of utilities ask, but if I design a feed-in tariff policy in an island state, won't all of my customers race to become independent power producers and gradually take over the generation business? They will profit from long-term contracts that are underwritten by the utility, which are ultimately underwritten by the ratepayers or the government, and leave the utility with decreasing revenues to cover their fixed costs and to keep the reliability of the overall network in place. This question goes to the heart, I think, of many of the issues that utilities face and many of the questions that utilities ask themselves when considering whether to develop a policy like a feed-in tariff in a small island state. And we'll try to get to some of the issues and some of the potential pathways in the slides ahead. But much like net metering, feed-in tariff policies are often designed with many different kinds of caps and of controls in order to limit the market growth. So it's not a free-for-all, it's not the wild, wild west. There are caps often on project size, on total program size. There are sometimes caps on how many projects, how many megawatts or kilowatts can be connected per month or per year. So in the same way as net metering policies can be controlled and managed through the permitting process and through the policy design, feed-in tariff policies can also be sort of constrained or controlled in that way in order to meet the objectives of the utility or the government while keeping it on a managed path of transition. And I think the goal, ultimately, the important point is that the goal of encouraging all of these IPPs, all of these homeowners and businesses to export power to the grid is to diversify the generation mix away from costlier options. In many islands, as many of you know, I'm sure, the cost of generation can be prohibitively high and remains a major issue for both utilities as well as for the governments that often are responsible for paying the fuel bill. So the idea of diversifying the generation mix by drawing on customer investment, by whether it's hotels or businesses or individual households, can be still quite an attractive option for many utilities if that supply can be cheaper than the existing cost of supply from diesel generators or other forms of on-site of utility generation on the grid. So there's obviously balancing issues and that we'll get to in a moment, but the basic economics can still create a strong argument for utilities to start to encourage more IPP, even in very traditional, vertically integrated utility environments that we see in much of the Pacific and even in the Caribbean. So there's still an underlying rationale and an underlying economic basis to that decision. And perhaps most importantly, there's a way for utilities to do it in a way that produces win-wins. So this comes to the question of whether feed-in tariffs are appropriate at all for island regions. Many will have heard the example of Spain, where much more rapid development occurred than the government anticipated. It was paying too much for the solar in particular that it was connecting to the grid, which then led the government to backpedal and introduce retroactive changes. So many utilities, many governments around the world have looked at Spain as a bit of a cautionary tale for feed-in tariffs. And I think it's led a lot of island regulators and utility officials, utility executives to question whether this is a workable policy on an island, particularly in a small island grid where you have very limited land and very limited grid infrastructure and flexibility in the system. As I mentioned, the monitoring of applications with clear permitting procedures can actually limit the risks of much of that runaway development that we've seen in countries like Spain. There are ways to design feed-in tariffs that strike the balance, that provide a controlled, regulated environment for those win-win developments to take place and for individual investors and customers to be able to contribute to electricity generation in the island. So like net metering, there are some different ways of structuring a feed-in tariff. So if an island decides that they want to go down that route and encourage people to develop their own renewable energy projects and connect to the grid, there are three basic approaches. One is to structure the rate based on the cost of generation. That would be a classic feed-in tariff. The second is to tie it to utility avoided costs. I put here full utility avoided costs. Some say it should only be fuel avoided costs. I think that remains a nuance. But ultimately, that in that case, the tariff would fluctuate on an annual basis based on the utility's cost of procurement or of supply. And a third option is somewhere in between. And what we're seeing in many island regions is actually number three. Number one is really sort of classic feed-in tariffs, net meter, similar to what we see in jurisdictions like Germany. Utility avoided costs is still quite common. There are a number of jurisdictions now in islands that are doing this, but it's often not full utility avoided costs. So we do see something below avoided costs, but normally above the cost of generation. So it's sort of striking that space in between. A couple examples. I'll go through these quickly, and you can refer to the slides later on. But the U.S. Virgin Islands recently adopted a FIT that sets rates at a slight discount to the utilities avoided cost of generation. And the current anticipated rate is around 26 U.S. cents. So at 26 U.S. cents currently, PV can still be very attractive as an option for someone to develop in most island regions. And I think that's the compromise provisional tariff that's emerged out of debate so far in the Virgin Islands. In Hawaii, the tariff is a little bit lower, but they currently strike it differentiated by project size. So there's a range of around 19 U.S. cents to around 22 U.S. cents per kilowatt hour, but it still has been successful at attracting private investment. And some would even argue Hawaii has had to start applying the brakes to start to control the growth at those tariff levels. So it shows that at that range, Hawaii's been quite successful. And Grenada is the last example here where they offer two different pathways. One is a fixed FIT around 17 U.S. cents for 10 years, so a 10-year contract, or a rate that's linked to the utilities avoided costs and adjusted on an annual basis. So there is a different way of structuring that again, these strike that balance in the middle between kind of a classic feed-in tariff and a avoided cost linked price. So should it be, this leads to kind of the more philosophical or I guess ultimately practical financial question of whether they should be linked to avoided costs at all. On the one hand, it helps reduce the risk to the utility. So if the utility's cost of purchasing fuel declines, as it has in recent months, for instance, then the utilities don't have to pay out as much. But on the other hand, it creates a risk of overpaying when purchase fuel prices go high. And that means that it effectively eliminates any hedge benefit or hedge value that a utility might get from purchasing renewable energy, because when the prices of fuel go up, the prices that they have to pay for the renewable projects go up too. So you essentially defeat or you undermine the potential fixed price benefit of having renewables locked into the network. It also increases the risk to developers because ultimately anyone who wants to finance it, if they don't have a clear price and they don't know where fuel prices are going, it's going to be riskier to invest. And when it's riskier to invest, that typically means a higher cost of capital, which pushes up total generation costs. This is a really key issue for renewable energy finance. So a couple key points, taking a step back from the details here. I realize there's quite a lot packed in for those who are interested in more detailed, even more detailed considerations and questions. As I mentioned, Ilham will be posting more detailed text and additional questions after on the IRENA website. But taking a step back from some of these more technical, more policy-oriented questions, how should islands then develop this? I've provided a few key points here. On the one hand, it's important to have appropriate oversight of the permitting process, so you can make sure who's connecting, who's supplying, and control that overall queue. I think that's really key. Clear caps can help control market growth. The tariffs, if they are fixed, should be revised regularly. As we've seen, PV prices have crashed dramatically in recent years, so it's important to constantly monitor and adjust prices. This is something that the utility commissions can support in doing. The fourth is to implement a clear accounting and monitoring system. So this really helps keep the overall billing clear and helps provide security to project owners that they're going to be remunerated. The fifth is to publish annual reports. This is a really great way to share information with ratepayers and with local stakeholders about the progress of the policy. So how many projects, total capacity installed, this can really help, on the one hand, build support for the policy, but it also helps improve transparency. So annual reports are a great way to do that. There's a possibility to include incentives for storage systems to help smooth the fluctuations in the network. There's also, it could be important to increase forecasting capabilities. This has become particularly important in main islands like Hawaii, increasing the forecasting capabilities to anticipate any dips in supply, for example, due to cloud cover, or as we saw recently in Tonga, due to volcanoes. So issues like that can really be important in helping maintain stability in the grid and ultimately keeping the lights on. And finally, I include this last point about consider the use of demand sinks. So loads that can effectively be dispatched and turned on when there's too much generation in the network. So that could be desalination plants, as we're seeing currently in Cape Verde, dispatching heating and cooling loads, ice production, a host of other potential loads that can be essentially flicked on in order to better align supply with demand. And I think as islands start to move to more ambitious renewable energy strategies, more ambitious renewable energy targets, these kinds of stabilization mechanisms are going to play an increasingly important role. Now, let's shift quickly to the utility-led models before we get to the PPAs. Question emerges, rather than using a FIT or net metering, why don't utilities just develop projects on their own? And that's a fair question. I think many utilities are familiar with, they develop their own generation assets, they develop their own distribution assets, and have in the past. So what stops them from investing themselves in renewable energy projects? I think that's a valid question for utilities that have the existing access to capital, access to finance, and ultimately also access to land where they can develop potential projects. So, three basic options. On the one hand is utility-owned and financed, where the utility is privatized. So a private utility would finance the construction and own the asset. And on that, the regulatory commission would give them a regulated rate of return of some kind on that investment, similar to investments in the diesel plants, where effectively they have some form of return, in many cases, not all, regulated rate of return. In that case, the operations and maintenance can be performed directly by the utility or subcontracted to someone else. So this is the model that HECO, for example, uses in Hawaii for many of its renewable energy projects. Now, HECO also has a feed-in tariff, also implements net metering, but in addition to that, they also have their own utility-owned projects. So none of these are mutually exclusive. Utilities can play more than one instrument at once. Utilities can encourage net metering customers. For those customers who are interested, they can encourage feed-in tariff or long-term contracts with IPP type producers, and they can also develop their own projects that they own and in many cases finance. So these are not mutually exclusive development options or policy options. The second is where the utility owns it and finances it, but it's public, a public utility. So in the Pacific Island regions, for example, most island utilities, with the exception of Vanuatu, are essentially publicly owned. In that case, the utility would finance their own project. It would be a publicly owned project, and they could maybe subcontract the maintenance to a maintenance provider or to the original EPC team that built the project. One good example of this is Electra in Cape Verde. I think there's a good growing number of utilities are starting, the publicly owned utilities are starting to move somewhere down this path. The third option is utility-led approach, privately owned, where they effectively lead the procurement process. They don't own the asset, but they buy from independent power producers. So this would be closer to kind of your classic feed-in tariff approach, where the utility pays IPPs for their production. In the Cayman Islands, in addition to the FIT, they also use competitive tenders to procure from independent producers. So in that context, essentially the utility remains in control of the wires, but is playing a diminished role in the generation business. And they buy their generation from IPPs who can do it for cheaper than often than they can do it themselves. And there's another example here from Ramea Island in Canada, where they have a small wind project on a bilateral contract. So many different configurations. There are more than I've outlined here, but it gives you an idea of some of the different pathways that utilities can choose. A broader question that relates to this is how utilities should allocate those contracts, should allocate those PPAs. So on the one hand is, we talked about the pricing issues and how to set the prices, but a related issue is how to allocate them. And this is where many of these different issues converge or come together. On the one hand, there's competitive tendering of some kind, either auctions, or that can be one way to allocate contracts. The second is to offer something like a standard offer, a feed-in tariff of some kind that allocates it on usually on a first-come, first-served basis to interested participants who meet the basic pre-qualification requirements. And the third is through some kind of bilateral negotiation. And as I mentioned, in some cases, some utilities use all of these different approaches simultaneously to procure generation in the system. So these are not mutually exclusive. Now, let's shift to the PPA questions before we open this up to questions from the audience. Designing bankable PPAs is really one of the most important aspects of getting the design right in island regions. What is a bankable PPA? So first of all, a power purchase agreement is effectively a long-term offtake agreement for the power produced, purchased by one buyer from another. So typically an IPP can supply power to the grid, sign an IPP contract over a fixed period of time, and effectively, provided that they comply with the terms of the contract, can be paid a performance-based price over the course of the contract period. So PPA effectively provides legal regulatory certainty on a contractual basis between a producer and a purchaser of power. That's the most basic level. That's what a PPA is. Some would argue that a feed-in tariff is ultimately just a form of PPA that's more standardized, or that has that allows a wider number of people to benefit on standard offer terms to participate. And I think that's a fair point. There's quite a bit of similarity ultimately between a feed-in tariff contract and a PPA, and you could argue they're effectively the same. The goal of a good PPA is to provide a revenue stream that's sufficient to cover costs plus a reasonable rate of return. And that's at its most basic level what makes a bankable PPA. It needs to be sufficient to cover the cost of generation. Some key requirements. So I've introduced this list. I could go on. There's a lot of other elements here to unpack, but I thought I would try to condense this into one slide to make it easier for people who want to follow up on this after the fact. First, a cost-reflective tariff, ideally fixed. Banks don't like the volatility in the tariff structure. So if you can have a fixed contract, that really helps the bankability. There needs to be something on currency provisions. So often currencies can be quite volatile not only in island regions, but including in island regions. And having some sort of provision to reduce the currency risks can be very important, particularly for attracting foreign investment. So if you're relying on your own customers in your own country, like in Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, or in the U.S. Virgin Islands or in the Caymans, then the issue of currency may not be as important as long as the capital comes domestically from the domestic environment. But as soon as capital is coming from outside, currency questions become really important. Inflation risk. So most PPAs include some kind of inflation indexation. That means the tariff value in the PPA contract goes up by a certain amount per year. Now, it's very important to focus on how much it goes up by. It shouldn't be too much, obviously, to be too generous, but it obviously shouldn't be zero. So in most cases, there's a balance is struck, and that's a really important design feature of a bankable PPA. The fourth is protection against dispatch risk, essentially providing guaranteed purchase for that supply. So the utility can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't accept your kilowatt hours today, and choose not to buy them, because the renewable energy project is based on the forecast that all of its generation will be purchased by the utility, and that creates the incentive to manage the project well and maximize the output of the system. So there needs to be, ideally, that guaranteed purchase provision built in. And if the utility can't wheel the power for some reason due to failure in the grid, there should be, and there often is, the obligation that the utility pays for the power, even if they can't wheel it to customers, in most cases. Now, there's always legal exceptions to this if it's due to weather, storms, hurricanes, but as a principle, that remains. The fifth is keeping the regulatory, political, and legal risks low. So once the PPA is signed, it shouldn't be changed retroactively. The basic stability of the contract is key. Should be protection against force majeure, a dispute resolution mechanism in case that there are disputes around curtailment, for example, or around interpretation of particular contract clauses, dispute around payment, for example, if IPPs aren't being paid on time. There needs to be some independent dispute resolution mechanism. Now that, in many islands, that's quite difficult because the islands are quite small, and in some cases they appeal to external dispute resolution mechanisms rather than relying on internal ones within the jurisdiction. The eighth point is termination clauses. So there should be provisions around what happens when someone decides they would like to cancel the contract. It could be the IPP because they found a more attractive buyer, or it may be the utility because the contract is linked to avoided costs and they would rather change the contract provision. So there should be some pathway to open up a termination clause. Ultimately, most of the time, this comes down to non-compliance with the contract terms on one of the two parties' sides. So either the generator isn't generating reliably according to the contract, or the purchaser isn't purchasing reliably, and then there can be some grounds for termination. Another issue is when there's changes in the market. If the utility gets privatized, for example, what happens to the existing IPP commitment? So those issues become more complicated, but suffice to say, it's important to have a clause in there. And finally, low interconnection risk. Bankable PPAs should have clear provisions for how the connection to the grid is going to happen, who pays for substations, who pays for line upgrades. Those issues should be spelled out clearly. Some guidelines. So in addition to those key points, there are some basic guidelines that island utilities and regulators should keep in mind as they enter into PPA negotiations. We went into much more detail during the workshops in Fiji on this, and I encourage you to do more research and dig. But a really important starting point on this is to seek out other PPA contracts that have been signed, either in the region, in the island region, or globally, just to compare the structure. Obviously, these differ based on legal regime, but a guideline PPA can be quite useful, just to compare to make sure that the clauses are similar and that there aren't any major gaps. The second is clauses in the contract should be organized on a topical basis. So it makes it easier to compare apples to apples. So you have basic clauses that deal with basic issues, and then you can get into the details in each specific clause. The third is there are some sample PPA contracts available that can be downloaded, and they can identify clauses that you may be missing. In some cases, it may need to be adapted to the local island context. So for example, there can be specific clauses requiring certain inverter types that are well adapted to salty marine context. Issues like that don't emerge if you're working in the desert, but they can be very critical if you're working in an island context. So sometimes that kind of provision can be built in to the PPA contract itself. And the fourth, hiring an expert with experience in PPA design in island regions specifically can be quite valuable, particularly during the contract negotiations. So it can be quite valuable to help draft the contract, review it, and just participate generally in supporting the PPA negotiation process. So it can be a way to help mitigate the risks of getting this on. Now, a few concluding remarks. So despite the fact that renewables are increasingly cheaper than conventional supply options, it's still important to have a strong policy and regulatory framework to create the right conditions for new investments to occur. Many will argue or have said that, well, if renewables are currently cheaper, why do we even need policy? Because they should be able to compete on an open basis. The reality is when you have to connect to the grid to do anything, you need some kind of regulatory provisions for that in order to provide the certainty or the security that the investment will be recovered. And renewable technologies are capital intensive. They often have quite long payback period. So in order for that hurdle to be overcome, it's very important to have the right conditions in place that allow new investments to occur. And as I pointed out, and as we can see from many of the different examples around the world, I could go on in different case studies of the Cook Islands, Cape Verde, Bonaire in the Caribbean. There's countless examples around the world where the economics are clear win-wins. And I think the important lesson for many island representatives and utilities around the world now is how do we make that win-win situation happen at home? How do we make that happen in our island? And I hope that some of the slides and some of the discussion points that I've gone through have been helpful in moving that forward. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we'll go to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Toby, for this interesting presentation today. So let's go now for the questions and answers.